You can't just say this is the way it is, therefore it ought to be that way. You got to have good reasons. So I claim, well, we do have good reasons. Democracies are better than autocracies. Free markets are better than top-down tyrannical economic systems, communist systems, and so on. There's certain things we know work. You can measure it.
Hi, I'm Zach Weissmuller for Reason TV. I'm here with Michael Shermer, author, editor of Skeptic Magazine, monthly columnist at Scientific American, and professor at Chapman University. His latest book is The Moral Arc: How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Towards Truth, Justice, and Freedom. Michael, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
The book builds in many ways on the works of writers like Steven Pinker in that it tries to demonstrate that the world's becoming not only less violent and in many ways more prosperous, but actually more moral. And you tie that growth in morality or that moral evolution to an embrace of reason and science. But before we get too deeply into that, I just want to define terms. What is morality?
Well, here we're talking about how people treat one another. There's no moral questions if you're alone on a desert island by yourself. So I'm building on the idea of the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. Things that lead to more of that are moral, things that lead to less of that are not moral or immoral. And I use that because I'm taking a biological approach. So in addition to Pinker, Sam Harris's moral landscape, I'm building on that as well. Sam starts with just a philosophical starting point of the well-being of conscious creatures is how he phrases it. But why there? Why start there? I claim that evolution has endowed us with a desire to survive and flourish. By survival, I mean, just being able to be alive, and flourishing, having enough to eat, a place to sleep, social network if you're a social species, and so forth. Just the basics of life. And what I'm claiming is that we've gotten better at doing that, especially over the last several centuries, of considering more and more people as worthy of being in our moral community, as people whose survival and flourishing we care about. To the point now that we even care about animals, other sentient beings.
Describe briefly what you mean by sentience and why you chose that as your baseline for morality.
Yes, by sentience I mean the ability to feel, sense, emote, suffer, and so on. So, and this is building on the work of Jeremy Bentham, who said about animals, it isn't that can they think, can they talk, can they make tools, those kinds of things that we've always talked about distinguishing ourselves from other animals, but can they feel, can they suffer? And that's a deeper part of the brain. Whether you can have language or tool use or higher forms of cognition in the cerebral cortex, that is vouchsafed really pretty much to us and maybe one or two other species if you count chimps or something like that, or dolphins. But when I'm talking about, what Bentham was talking about, is a much deeper evolutionary parts of the brain, the limbic system, the amygdala, areas, the hippocampus, areas that are old, evolutionarily ancient, that have to do with just the basics of survival, flourishing, suffering, pain.
When we talk about the modern liberal tradition, it's often been defined at the human level, and the idea of humanism. Does this conflict with that at all? Do you think that it undermines the idea that only humans have rights?
No, it doesn't conflict at all. I'm just saying, let's just go even further. Now, I will admit, we haven't even accomplished that yet. As much progress as we made, you only have to tune in the daily news to see that there's still violations of human rights. Clearly, not all humans are in the moral sphere yet. But in the Western liberal tradition, in Western democracies, at least in principle, every single human being should be a member of the moral community. And now with the animal rights movement, all the great apes, pretty much all primates, marine mammals, any sentient being capable of suffering and feeling, which is a lot of species, should be incorporated in that. If not in practice, at least in principle, and we should work toward that.
You grapple with the question that philosophers and scientists have dealt with for ages, which is morality innate, or do we learn it from our parents, priests, community, or something in between? What does the scientific evidence point to along that spectrum?
The evidence is pretty strong that it's mixed. Of course, your environment makes a big difference. But just in terms of evolutionary perspective, we evolved a capacity to care about other sentient beings, to also be concerned about them or worried about them or aggressive toward them. So we have this dual nature of being both amicable and cooperative and altruistic to our fellow in-group members, but being xenophobic, aggressive, violent against out-group members. And there's perfectly good reasons why that would be. As Jared Diamond likes to say about the indigenous peoples he encounters in Papua New Guinea, if you encounter a complete stranger out on a path, it would be suicide to just stick your hand out and say, you know, welcome neighbor, like we do in the West, because it's a good chance you'd be killed. So it's good to be cautious. It's good to be xenophobic in terms of our evolutionary perspective. Now, what's happened is that we've developed civil societies in which the rule of law and other mechanisms make it more trustworthy that it's okay to shake a total stranger's hand. What we've done by expanding the moral sphere is to say, let's keep those negative aspects of our nature in check, xenophobia, aggressiveness, violence, that sort of thing, and try to push the better angels. As Pinker likes to say, we have inner demons and better angels, and what's been happening for the last several centuries is the better angels are winning out over the inner demons. But they're really there. They're part of our nature for good reason, not just some cultural thing. And so while culture tweaks your moral sentiments, the basics of it are inside, the sense of revenge and justice and desire for equality and equal treatment. Those things are part of our nature.
And you make the case that the key to expanding, or a key component of expanding that moral sphere, has been the existence of empathy, or imagining the perspective of others, and that this is an evolved trait. How did that evolve, and why is it so important to the moral arc?
Empathy, it's not a foolproof thing. You can empathize with your in-group against other people, so that it can cut both ways. But what I'm talking about here is just the capacity to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is innate. It's definitely there. Adam Smith talked about it in his first book, that morality is based on the fact that we're able to do this. And not just mind read, where I can imagine what you're thinking, but actually feel if you're suffering. I can feel you're suffering. That's the basis of morality. Now, the reason for that is because we're a social primate species. And so we have to get along with other members of our group. We have to kind of know what they're thinking and feeling in order to anticipate their actions. In order to get them to cooperate with us, we have to cooperate with them. You can't just pretend to be a nice person, because if you're faking and you're just manipulating, using people like a psychopath would to get something, other people will see that. You can tell the tells, the cues that somebody's pretending. So it's real morality, not pretend. It's not a calculation. Evolution's done the calculating for us. We actually feel. Emotions are proxies to drive behavior. So it's better to actually feel empathy for somebody else rather than just pretend it.
In the book, you talk a lot about individual rights, and you say that actually, scientifically speaking, it makes sense to define rights at an individual level rather than a collective level. What's the scientific case for individual rights?
I would call that natural law. That is, nature has endowed us individually to care about our own well-being and that of our immediate kin and kind, and beyond that, no. So I'm not a group selectionist. I don't think evolution is based on group selection. I think it's based on the individual organism, setting aside ants and social insects or something like that. But just taking primates, for example, it's based on whether you personally can suffer. And then from there, you can just expand out, well, when we talk about the right to vote, you know, blacks now have the right to vote, or women have the right to vote, but it isn't women as a group that go in to vote. It's a woman, or it's a black person, or if it's violation of rights, it's a woman who suffers, or a black person who suffers at the hands of oppressors. And so it's the suffering of an individual that is what we should care about, because groups can't suffer. Those are just concepts. A concept can't suffer. But an individual organism with a brain that senses pain and records that, that's where it's at.
Here at Reason, our tagline is free minds and free markets. And you draw a pretty clear connection between the two when you talk about the emergence of free markets kind of at the same time as the scientific revolution was occurring. And you identify a group of French scientists who called themselves physiocrats. Could you just explain kind of the simultaneous rise of scientific ideas and laissez-faire?
After the scientific revolution, particularly with the synthesis of the physical sciences, from Galileo through Newton, everybody after that wanted to do something similar in their areas: biology, medicine, law, economics, politics, and so on. Thomas Hobbes, for example, self-consciously said, "I am the Galileo of civil society," by which he meant not just I want to be famous like these guys, but that just like Newton discovered there are certain principles and laws that govern the universe and the physical world, and Harvey showed that there's certain principles of the heart beating and the circulatory system and so on that operate in everybody, and that these are laws we can understand and then apply and try to make the world a better place. So Hobbes said that about the civil society, and so ever since Hobbes, all the Enlightenment thinkers all the way through Locke and Jefferson and Franklin and so on, and these guys were all scientists of a sort. I mean, they didn't call themselves that. The word wasn't even used. Natural philosophers. They were looking for principles. So the physiocrats were saying, hey, maybe the economy is like the human body. There's a flow of capital like a flow of blood, and there's a system to the world in economics that we can understand it. Now they concluded that it's best to not have too much regulation in it because it'll flow more smoothly like blood through the body without all these controls on it. And so that gave rise to the whole free market economic theory. And that turns out, as I show, to actually be really good for expanding the moral sphere. If you want to break down the xenophobic barriers between strangers, there's no surer way to do it than let them trade and each make a profit from each other. Because it doesn't matter what color you are, what gender you are, what sexual preference you are. I only care about your price and your quality of your product, and from that we develop trust. And it turns out that nations that trade with each other are less likely to have conflict. Democracies and free trade are two of the biggest factors predicting less violence between states.
Everything you're saying kind of rests on the claim that morality is universal and discoverable. The critique that you probably get sometimes, maybe you'd call it the postmodern critique, is that there is no truth, or at least it's not discoverable, and that logic and reason are arbitrary cultural rules. Is there anything to that? Are there limits to how far rational debate and reason can actually get us?
You ever heard Dawkins' expression about show me a postmodernist at 30,000 feet in a jet, and I'll show you a hypocrite. I mean, even they who say there's no such thing as reality, there is a reality, and it better be working right in a jet at 30,000 feet. Well, the same is true for morality. You show me a postmodernist says there's no such thing as right and wrong, and then cheat them out of their income tax or some deal that they got, and they'll immediately feel vengeful, angry, hurt, that there was an injustice they want righted. Everybody feels that way. Primates feel that way. It's inborn. We care about what's fair. We care about being treated. And those things, I claim, are real. They're discoverable in the brains of social primates like us.
But do you think there's really a possibility of reaching consensus about these things that are all true, the universal true things?
Well, probably not quite as consensual as, say, F equals ma in physics. The equations are going to be a lot more complex than that. But still, in general, there's, I think, certain principles we can all agree on. It really is fairly basic, and everybody knows those principles. They feel them deeply inside. The moment you prick somebody, do I not bleed? As Shakespeare's Shylock. I hurt too. I feel vengeful too. This is part of human nature. And everybody knows this. I think this postmodern thing, this too shall pass. And this whole nonsense, I also debunked this nonsense about the is-ought barrier, the naturalistic fallacy. Hume never meant that. Hume just said you shouldn't extrapolate into moral values without good reason. You can't just say this is the way it is, therefore it ought to be that way. You got to have good reasons. So I claim, well, we do have good reasons. Democracies are better than autocracies. Free markets are better than top-down tyrannical, economic systems, communist systems, and so on. There's certain things we know work. You can measure it. Just look at North Korea versus South Korea on a nighttime map. You can see the difference. Or look at the average height of North Koreans versus South Koreans. It's about 3 inches difference. These political economic systems translate into real health measures, quality of life measures.
You emphasize that empiricism is a process, the scientific method is a process, and The benefit of it is you actually have to prove your way is better than my way instead of just pointing to some tradition. The response to that from a conservative perspective, or maybe even sometimes a libertarian perspective, is that you can veer into what Hayek called scientism, where you're relying on so-called experts who think they know more than they actually do know. And that's where the role of tradition is. Tradition shows you that this institution has worked and survived over a long period of time. How do you avoid falling into the trap of scientism or pseudoscientific traps?
But even like Burke's notion that tradition should matter, because those things that are built up over centuries are tried and true. But that's an empirical argument. That's saying, look, our ancestors for the past century have tried a lot of different things, and these things they came up with, they learned from hard knocks experience. So we shouldn't just overthrow the regime on a whim. But that's not a philosophical argument. That's saying we have data showing that this works. So before you say it doesn't work, you better have good arguments counter. Even that's an Enlightenment rational argument. That's an argument based on reason. You can't just say, we're going to overthrow the government just because I feel like it. You better have good reasons for it, and they better be better than the last century's worth of data we have. Even a democracy where, we can't agree, you think one thing, I think the other thing, so we're going to put it up for a vote. But even that's a kind of an experiment. Franklin called it, and Jefferson both referred to it as the American experiment. And their argument was that no one knows how to run a country. Nobody can do it on their own. So we have to set it up where we tweak the variables and run the experiment for a couple of years, then tweak them again and run it again. And so even that, you can take like all 50 different states and look at all their different tax systems and say, well, which ones produce this and that and the other? You have data sets. That's a kind of empirical experiment.
The title of the book, The Moral Arc, comes from a 19th century abolitionist preacher who said essentially that the moral arc is a long one, but it bends towards justice. Where do you think Parker's sense of optimism came from, and where does yours come from?
Well, Parker's, who inspired, of course, Martin Luther King Jr.'s, I think both of theirs was more of wanting things to be a certain way rather than seeing that is the way that they are. Because when he said that on the eve of the American Civil War, when slavery was in full bloom in the United States, it didn't seem like it was bending anywhere but bad. But still, I think that's an optimism of we want to make things better. I think now we have the data to show that it really has gotten better. Even when King said it in 63, there had been some measurable progress, but I think most of it that we've observed has happened in the last half century or so. There's the data we've collected about the past and the things that have happened so rapidly is just in the last half century. And so I think if we extrapolate that out, there is reason for hope.
What are some of the kind of greatest developments that you see that in the data that give you that sense of optimism?
Well, I think, for example, the number of electoral democracies, liberal democracies, where everyone has the franchise, that was essentially zero in 1900. Women couldn't vote in any major country until the early 20th century, for example. And now that figure is up to 119 out of the 190 countries. So we're over half now. And so that's progress, the spread of civil rights and civil liberties to almost everybody, pretty much everybody in the Western world, even gays, same-sex marriage and homosexuality. We're in the middle of that revolution right now, and it's a beautiful thing because you can see how it unfolds. You can see who objects to it, mostly conservative religious people. You can see their arguments, which are based on holy books and so forth. And you can watch them tumble and change their minds. Even Obama, when he ran in 08, I think marriage between a man and a woman. And then 12, I changed my mind. Why? Why did he change his mind? Why have all these people changed their mind? Because there's this sweeping tide of cultural shift toward expanding that moral sphere, and there's no good arguments, really, why gays shouldn't be allowed to marry. I'm optimistic because if that can happen, then even us atheist secularists, who are sort of the last of the groups to be prejudiced against, and then animals, I think all this is going to happen in our lifetime, and I predict that by, say, 2020, gay marriage will be like the black and white drinking fountains or interracial marriages debates were in the 50s. And that today's conservatives are more liberal than liberals were in the 50s.
Just to wrap up, what are the biggest obstacles that you see standing in the way of that moral progress, and how are we going to circumvent around them?
I think the biggest thing I'm concerned about is Islamic fundamentalism, ISIS, Taliban. It's religion, theocracies, tradition that's grounded in nothing rational. You can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason their way into in the first place. It's a pure, tribal, deep instinct based in religion. Religion's my biggest concern. Fundamentalist, conservative religion. I mean, liberal Christians, Jews and so forth that have gone through the Enlightenment, that's not a concern. It's the pre-Enlightenment or non-Enlightenment religious communities that are the most threatening.
Michael Shermer, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
For Reason TV, I'm Zach Weissmuller.